All right, welcome to another session in the Gospel of Mark. This week we are going to be looking at Mark chapter 6, verse 30 to the end of the chapter. And we are going to look at two events. The first is Jesus feeds the thousands. It's the only miracle other than the resurrection that is mentioned in all four Gospels. In the Synoptics, it follows reference to Herod killing John the Baptist. And it's interesting to note that this miracle takes place outside of Herod's territory. Jesus moves away from Herod during this season. And what takes place is that while Jesus is trying to go away with the disciples to a quiet place, a desert, if you will, the crowds see him as he's passing by in the boat from the shore, and so they follow him and actually end up there ahead of him. And rather than being angry with the people for not giving them any peace, Jesus has compassion on them, and so teaches them. And it is a long sermon, and by the time it's done, it's the end of the day. And the disciples want to send the crowd away so that they can find something to eat. Jesus challenges them to feed them himself. This is quite a surprising thing because there were so many people. The disciples said it would take 8 months of a man's wages, literally in the Greek, 200 denarii. A denarii was about what a wage earner would make in a day. So that's where the 8 months' wages come from. And so they can't believe that Jesus would expect them to feed so many people. The only resources that they had were 5 loaves and 2 small fish. And in the Gospel of John, we are told that these few provisions come from a small boy that Andrew found in the crowd. There were 5,000 men besides women and children, as we learn in Matthew. The word men in Mark basically assumes this. It's a word that can mean husband or man, but it never means generic man, as in men and women. John does use the term generic, which could open the possibility of merely 5,000 men, but the rest of the Gospels make it quite clear that there were many others besides. There were 5,000 men plus women and children. And so all these were fed, and 12 basketfuls of leftovers remained. And I think there's a lot of symbolism going on here. Here we have a crowd in the desert. They're being fed miraculously. This is almost certainly hearkening back to the Israelites in the desert, where God provided manna. In the Gospel of John, you will see that he moves right into a discussion about manna in the desert in preaching after this episode. And so John makes that allusion explicit, but here in the Gospels we see that these 12 basketfuls would represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And so I think we're pretty safe to assume that that was a significance. I mean, we can never read the author's mind or what Jesus had in mind or what God had in mind, but it certainly seems like more than a coincidence that out of 5 loaves and 2 fish, you end up with 12 basketfuls. It also speaks to the providence of God, that he provided not only enough, but more than enough for all of the wants of the people, all their needs. And again, if we want to look at another contrast, we could contrast Jesus feeding the 5,000 with Herod's wedding feast, where he would have provided all kinds of succulent food, very rich food, but with Jesus, the true king, he gives generously of simple and good food to eat to sustain people rather than extravagance. So contrasting the two types of kings in that situation. And if it moves from Herod directly to that story in Matthew, Mark, and John, the next thing that happens in the Gospel of Mark is common to all three of those Gospels. It's not mentioned in Luke, but it's mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and John. And it takes place this way. As a direct result of Jesus trying to disperse the crowd, he wants them to go away. If we look at the Gospel of John, it seems quite clear that the people are starting to talk about making him a Messiah by force. It's not said explicitly in the Synoptics, but you could see that happening. He wants to get rid of the crowd, and he wants to be alone to pray, so he sends the disciples ahead by boat. And what takes place next is that Jesus spends a lot of time in prayer, and it's not until the fourth watch of the night where he goes to rejoin the disciples. But they, at this point, are in the middle of the lake. And the fourth watch of the night is between 3 and 6 a.m., and it was a Roman way of measuring time. Jesus walks on the water towards them, and they're terrified because they think him a ghost. They see this, what looks like a man walking on water, and of course, men don't walk on water. And so they thought that Jesus was a ghost. And so in response, Jesus says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And there's a lot of ink, a lot of commentary on the phrase, "It is I." And most commentators believe that Jesus is simply saying, "It's me, it's Jesus." But the wording leaves open the possibility that he may be saying more. "It is I" is an emphatic way to say, "It's me." But in the Greek Old Testament, "it is I" is also the phrase that God describes of himself when he says, "I am." And so it is possible that Jesus is saying more than meets the eye here. And they're not to be afraid, because not only is Jesus with them, but God is with them. And this is interesting. And we don't always know exactly what's being intended by the authors, but we have to expect that for Christians reading this later with a fuller awareness, they couldn't miss this this possibility here for sure. And we have to keep in mind too, there are those who say, well, the divinity of Jesus developed later. Well, the reality is, as we've already said in the dating of the Gospels, that the first New Testament documents that were actually written down were not the Gospels, but the epistles. And so it's clear that by the time the Gospels themselves were written down, it was universally held by the church that Jesus was, in fact, God incarnate. Not saying that the disciples were aware of it at the time. They weren't. They didn't understand, as we see in this story as well. But it is certainly something that would have been assumed and fully aware by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So this isn't something that happened later, that people read the Gospels and read Jesus' divinity into it. The authors themselves already knew about the divinity of Jesus. So Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, it is I." He comes into the boat, and the first thing that happens is the wind immediately dies down. And so they're able to make their way to the shore. But Mark makes one more comment, that the disciples' hearts were hardened. They were amazed to see Jesus walking on water. But then Mark says that the disciples' hearts were hardened. What does he mean? Well, they didn't understand the miracle of the miraculous feeding of the thousands. That Jesus was showing his power, that Jesus was showing who he was. But the disciples could not yet fully grasp it. So here we see this veiled incarnation, where the flesh of Jesus actually hinders the people from fully realizing completely who he was. And I believe that's why Mark makes this comment, the disciples' hearts were hardened. They could not yet see the truth, the full truth of their Rabbi Jesus, that he was indeed God's Son. All right, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.